A judge unleashed a barrage of insults at Pam Bondi right in the middle of a public courtroom, but within moments she turned the tables, having him restrained in handcuffs. An outcome so stunning, it's hard to believe what transpired next. Pam Bondi was no novice when it came to high-pressure situations. She'd spent years entrenched in the legal battlefield, taking on some of the most formidable cases across the nation. Yet, this day carried a different weight as she stepped into the courtroom presided over by Judge Howard Gates, a figure infamous for his cutting remarks and erratic judicial decisions. She knew from the outset that this wouldn't be a routine proceeding. The case they were tackling was a blockbuster, a government ethics violation with the potential to upend more than just a few political careers. At its center was a wealthy developer, deeply entwined with influential political circles, accused of siphoning public funds into his personal projects. The evidence Bondi had amassed was formidable, and she arrived fully prepared to lay it out. What she hadn't braced herself for, however, was the palpable hostility radiating from the judge's bench the moment she walked in. Before she could even begin her argument, Judge Gates barely acknowledged her presence, his eyes fixed downward as he flipped through a dossier with exaggerated slowness, letting an oppressive silence settle over the courtroom, a silence that wasn't just procedural, but deliberately wielded to assert his control. Finally, without so much as a glance in her direction, he spoke. "Miss Bondi, I trust you brought something worthwhile today, or should we jump straight to where you squander my time?" A few snickers rippled from the back, mostly from the defendant's legal team, but Bondi brushed them off. She'd endured worse. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady, "I believe the evidence will stand on its own. This case concerns the misuse of public funds, and my duty is to present the facts precisely." Gates leaned back in his chair, feigning disinterest. "Public funds, you say," he drawled, "because that's never underpinned a baseless claim." Bondi's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure intact. "With respect, Your Honor," she countered, "I wouldn't deem felony corruption charges trivial." For a fleeting moment, their eyes met, his cold and calculating, hers unyielding. But before she could press forward, he cut her off again. "Mrs. Bondi, spare me the sermons," he snapped. "Just get to it. I don't have all day to indulge whatever theatrics you've rehearsed." Whispers began to spread among the onlookers. The courtroom wasn't packed, but those present were on edge, sensing an unusual tension. Judges could be tough, but this felt personal. Pam took a deep breath, recalibrating her approach. She understood his tactic. Gates was trying to throw her off balance, to dictate the pace and force her onto the defensive. But she wasn't about to let him have that win. Reaching for a folder on the table, she opened it and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to draw the court's focus to Exhibit A. These financial logs plainly reveal..." "Miss Bondi," Gates interrupted sharply, "do you always bury people in documents, or is this your method of overcompensating?" The jab landed hard, and the room's atmosphere shifted instantly. The defense lawyer grinned, a few journalists swapped glances, but Bondi stood her ground. She'd learned long ago that men like Judge Gates thrived on intimidation. The only way to counter them was to never let them see you falter. She paused just long enough to make her point silently, then set the folder down and clapped her hands lightly. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "if you'd rather keep this personal, I'm glad to request a break while we resolve any professional issues you might have." It was subtle, not confrontational, not rude, but razor sharp, a clear signal she wouldn't back down. The judge's lips twitched faintly. Was it amusement or irritation? It was hard to tell, but he wasn't done yet. "Oh, I've no issues, Miss Bondi," he replied coolly. "I simply recognize a flimsy case when I see it." This time, the reaction wasn't just whispers. A few gasps broke out, and someone muttered under their breath. This wasn't how a judge was supposed to steer a hearing. Pam could feel the room's energy shifting, with eyes darting between her and Gates like spectators at a tense match. She refused to descend into a shouting match. That's what he wanted. Instead, she smoothed her blazer, aligned some papers, and locked eyes with him. Then, she said firmly, I suppose we should let the facts speak. But as she spoke, she caught something in his expression. Not just pride or disdain, but a deeper flicker. Like a man with a personal stake in the case's outcome. That's when it hit her. This wasn't mere courtroom drama. Judge Gates wasn't clashing for amusement. He was hiding something. What he didn't realize was that she had her own cards to play. Pam Bondi had faced countless high-stakes hearings, but this one stood apart. Judge Gates wasn't just presiding. He was orchestrating a calculated effort to undermine her in front of everyone present. Why? She could feel the intensity of his stare as she pressed her arguments forward. Each word met with his readiness to pounce. She could almost see it, the faint curl of his mouth, the slow drum of his fingers on the bench, daring her to keep going. She wouldn't back off. "Your Honor," she said, her tone measured. "These records reveal a stark mismatch in the funding distributions. The defendant's firm received almost triple the sum approved in the initial budget, and none of it appears in state logs." She pivoted slightly, gesturing toward the projection screen where the financial data glowed. "Now, if you look here." "Miss Bondi," Gates cut in, his voice dripping with smugness, "I'd hate to disrupt your display. Truly, I would. But I think we've had enough figures for today." Bondi glanced at him, then back to the screen. He wasn't even pretending anymore. "Your Honor, with all due respect," she replied, "these figures form the case's core." "Right," he sneered, "and yet I see nothing that warrants dragging this court through this." There it was again. She heard a faint shuffle behind her. The prosecution team stirring, exchanging glances. They felt it too. Something was off. Bondi gripped her pen tighter, flipping to the next page in her file. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit a motion to." "Denied," he snapped. Silence fell. She looked up. "I haven't even outlined the motion yet," she said. "And still, I can tell you it's dead on arrival," Gates replied, leaning forward with his elbows on the bench. "Let's be frank, Miss Bondi. This whole case hinges on guesswork, a bit of clever bookkeeping, and suddenly you're screaming corruption." The defense attorney, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, smirked. He barely had to speak. Gates was doing his work for him. Bondi exhaled sloppily. "Your Honor," she pressed, "are you barring my motion before knowing its substance?" A pause stretched, a beat too long. "Then I'm refusing to entertain this farce any further," he declared. The courtroom wasn't just tense now. It was electric, with eyes shifting and heads swiveling. Even the reporters in the back scribbled faster. Bondi caught a juror's glance, a woman in her 50s, in a dark blazer, her brows knit, lips tight. She wasn't the only one taking note. Arrogance, she knew, had a way of drawing attention. Bondi squared her shoulders. "Very well, Your Honor," she said. "Then let's move to the next piece of evidence." She turned back to the screen, clicking to the next slide. "This document, secured via subpoena, shows that..." "Miss Bondi," Gates interrupted, his tone different now, a subtle shift. She stopped, looked at him. He was no longer slouched, no longer smug. His hands were clasped, his mouth a firm, thin line. Something had changed. "Approach the bench," he ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. She paused, then set her papers down and walked toward him. The courtroom hushed. When she reached him, he lowered his voice just enough for her alone to hear. "I'd strongly advise you rethink the path you're on here, Miss Bondi." She tilted her head slightly. "Pardon me. I'm saying," he murmured, "some battles aren't worth fighting." She let his words hang between them, then leaned in a fraction closer, deliberate and calm. "I don't scare easily, Judge Gates," she replied. A muscle in his jaw flexed. She turned and returned to her table. But that exchange revealed everything she needed to know. Back at her seat, Pam Bondi's mind raced. That wasn't just a power play. It was a warning, a veiled threat masked as judicial authority. But why? She'd walked into this courtroom expecting resistance, maybe even hostility. But this ran deeper. Judge Gates wasn't merely biased. He was guarding something, or someone. She neatened a stack of papers, keeping her expression neutral. The prosecution team beside her fidgeted, waiting for her next move. She didn't react, not yet. Instead, she lifted her chin and faced the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to resume presenting my evidence," she said. Gates didn't respond immediately. Letting the silence stretch, as if deciding how far to push. "Proceed," he said finally, "but make it quick." Bondi ignored the jab, reaching for the next file. "This document is a contract signed between the defendant and the city's planning board, detailing the proposed project costs. You'll see the listed total just exceeds $2 million. She paused then, with careful precision, placed another sheet on the projector. "However, this is an internal ledger from the defendant's firm, showing the actual funds transferred were nearly double that sum. And here," she laid down a third document, "is the approval signature, signed by..." She hesitated, letting the moment land. Judge Howard Gates. The courtroom didn't just shift, it fractured. A wave of motion erupted. Eyes darting, pen scratching. The defense attorney tensed, his smugness wiped away. Judge Gates didn't stir. For the first time since she'd entered, his face was unreadable. Bondi let the silence linger a beat longer, then continued. "Your Honor, would you care to clarify why your signature is on an unauthorized financial deal tied to the defendant?" It was a bold gamble. She didn't have the full story yet, but what she held was enough to rattle his foundation. Gates shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers pressed together, knuckles paling. "That document," he said slowly, "is inadmissible." Bondi tilted her head. "How so?" "It was obtained improperly," he replied. She let that settle. "Your Honor, this document was subpoenaed by my office." His nostrils flared. "Then it was mishandled. I'm ruling it inadmissible. It won't be considered here." The shift wasn't just in the gallery now. It was everywhere. The jury, the stenographer, even the bailiff, all watching. Bondi crossed her arms, her tone steady. "You realize this is a public session, correct? That the press is present, that everyone here just watched you dismiss key financial proof without cause." A muscle in his jaw leaped. "That's enough, Miss Bondi," he snapped. She didn't budge, didn't blink. Then slowly, Bondi sat, and that's when she made her move. She reached into her case, pulled out a small recorder, set it on the table, and hit play. A voice filled the room, low, gruff, unmistakable. "Take care of it. I don't care how." The recording crackled, then continued. "Make sure she doesn't touch those ledgers." Silence followed. Absolute, choking silence. Judge Gates didn't move, didn't breathe. Bondi didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Every soul in that room had heard him, and the real match was about to ignite. When the recording ceased, a dense, suffocating stillness lingered. No whispers, no hushed guesses, just a stunned, shared epiphany that Judge Howard Gates had been exposed. Pam Bondi stayed still, her gaze locked on the recorder, as if daring him to dispute it. He didn't, he couldn't. Across the room, the defense attorney blinked, his poise faltering. The smirk was gone, replaced by something akin to panic. He glanced at his client, the wealthy developer whose empire rested on secret pacts and political leverage. The man looked ashen. Judge Gates cleared his throat. "Miss Bondi, I don't know where you got that recording," he began, but she cut in, her voice firm. "That's not the question you should be asking, Your Honor. The real question is, who were you speaking to?" His fingers balled into fists. "This is outrageous," he snapped. "This whole hearing is spiraling into disorder because of your theatrics." "Disorder?" Bondi echoed, her tone light, almost wry. "I'd call this clarity. Finally, some openness in this courtroom." The tension notched higher. She let the moment breathe, let him stew, then reached for another document and slid it across the table. "Your Honor, this is a transcript of a wiretap, legally secured during our probe," she said, tapping the page's top. "It backs everything you just heard on that recording." Gates stared at the sheet, but didn't touch it, his chest heaving, his breathing audible. Bondi turned slightly, addressing the bailiff. "Officer Reynolds, would you please read the highlighted part aloud?" The bailiff paused, then took the transcript, his voice calm, but the words' gravity shrinking the room. "We'll handle her. Bondi doesn't have anything concrete yet, but if she does, I'll ensure it never reaches a courtroom." A sharp breath came from the gallery. Bondi clasped her hands. "I'd like to submit this as evidence, Your Honor." Gates's eyes flicked toward the exit, a small motion, but enough for the room to see he was thinking beyond his bravado, contemplating flight. But it was too late. "Motion denied," he barked. Bondi raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." "This hearing is done," he pressed, his voice a touch too loud. "I want our low." "Judge Gates," Bondi said smoothly, "I wasn't seeking your approval." Then she made her play. Turning to the courtroom's rear, she gave the slightest, supplest nod. A door swung open, footsteps rang against the polished floor, and a firm, commanding voice declared, "Judge Howard Gates, you are under arrest." Gasps burst from every corner. Reporters scrambled for their devices. Cameras snapped, the jury stared. Even the defendant, the mighty man who'd seen this trial as a formality, looked fluid. Gates didn't turn. He didn't speak. He sat there, eyes fixed on his bench, as if he could will it all away. But reality had overtaken him. Pam Bondi remained seated as two uniformed officers flanked the judge. One reached into his pocket. The other drew a pair of cuffs. "This is absurd," Gates muttered, though the defiance had ebbed. The officer didn't flinch. "You have the right to remain silent." And for the first time in his tenure, Judge Howard Gates truly was. The click of metal locking shut rang out as the cuffs secured around Judge Gates's wrists, sealing his downfall before the crowd he'd ruled over for years. The once dominant figure at the bench now sat motionless, his face a mask of disbelief. The courtroom buzzed with stunned whispers, disbelief sparking like static. Reporters raced to document the scene, their hands flying across notebooks. Even the jury, sworn to neutrality, couldn't mask their astonishment. Pam Bondi stayed seated, her expression unreadable. This wasn't about triumph or vengeance, but justice. Gates finally spoke, his words low, almost a murmur. "You can't do this." The officer gripping his arm didn't waver. "Sir, you're being detained for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit fraud, and abuse of judicial power. You'll get your chance to consult a lawyer." Gates tugged against the cuffs, his face reddening. "This is a disgrace. I am the law in this courtroom." Bondi rose, adjusting her blazer. "Not anymore." His head whipped toward her, arrogance giving way to dread. The officers hoisted him up, but he resisted. "This is political. This is..." Bondi shook her head. "This is accountability." The room fell silent again, a lifetime of unchecked authority, gone in a flash. Gates's face contorted, his jaw tightening as he scanned the gallery for a supporter, but no one stirred. It wasn't a blunder. The defense attorney had paled, and the developer, Charles Lawson, gripped the table's edge, his breathing faint. Bondi let her gaze rest on him briefly, before turning back to Gates. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "if you've anything to add, I'd suggest saving it for your arraignment." His mouth opened, then closed. He had nothing left. As the officers guided him to the exit, Lawson lurched up. Wait," he stammered, eyes flicking between Gates and Bondi. "This is spiraling out of control. We can figure something out." Bondi arched an eyebrow. "Figure something out." He swallowed, fraying visibly. "I mean, there's no need for this public fiasco. Let's be rational." She studied him, then stepped forward. "You seem rattled, Mr. Lawson." He forced a chuckle. "Rattled? No. This is just madness. You don't truly think Gates is guilty, do you?" She let the question linger. "Do you?" Silence. The door clicked shut behind Gates. At the moment's weight settled like a heavy mist. This wasn't just a case. It was a system unraveling. The courtroom felt lighter now, as if years of corruption's burden had lifted. Bondi took her seat, adjusting her files. The trial wasn't done, but the greatest hurdle was gone. She turned to Lawson, now silent, his arrogance replaced by calculation. "Mr. Lawson," she said, "would you like to proceed with today's session, or discuss a plea?" His jaw tightened. "This is a witch hunt," she offered a faint smile. "No, Mr. Lawson, this is justice," he scoffed. "You think one crooked judge changes anything? You think you've won?" She let the silence stretch. "I think it means the system still functions," she said finally. "The truth will always catch up." A colleague leaned in. "This might be the moment to press for a deal." Bondi waited. Sensing the jury's rapt attention, she stood. "To the presiding judge who will assume this case, I'd like to request to proceed with further evidence. We need a thorough probe into how deep this corruption runs." Murmurs rippled. "If my team could unearth this, there's more names, more untouchables." She turned to Lawson. "So, do you want to talk?" He sat stiff, then exhaled. "If I do, I want protection." She nodded. "Then you'd better start speaking." The power balance had tilted, and Bondi had signaled, "No one stands above the law." As reporters rushed to file their stories, this wasn't just a case. It was history, and just the beginning.